Hi, I'm Sam Atkinson and welcome to Compliance Unlocked. This is NSF's podcast. This is the first in the series of 6 episodes, and today we've got Pete Gough, who has spent 50 years in the industry, and we're going to be exploring that with him today. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you, Sam. Yes. Gosh, I can't believe it sometimes. Sometimes it's flown by and other times it seems to have taken forever. Yes.
Well, I'm not surprised. Well, tell us a little bit about it. I mean, you're a legend of your time. You've got a breadth of experience of 50 years and there must be some really fascinating stories in there. And it's a huge achievement for you as well. So, what have you witnessed?
Well, thank you. I'm going to split it into 2, I think. The changes, obviously the technical ones are kind of the more obvious ones, I guess. When I started as a QC analyst in the lab. And that stage, we had a new HPLC, was brand new, and it was a Varian system with a single piston pump.
Blimey. Using
normal phase with isooctane as the mobile phase, which was horrible stuff, and it was okay, but it wasn't great. But of course, very soon, within 5 years, we'd switched to normal reverse phase and water aqueous solvents and stuff. So that was fun. We developed our own LIMS system in-house. You couldn't buy them commercially, so we had one of the PhDs was a bit of a boff, and so he set up a LIMS system, and it was quite a big beast. It was the size of a filing cabinet.
Filing cabinet?
Yeah.
Really?
And it had the disk drives were about 2 feet across and about 1.5 inches thick, and I think they had a capacity of about 50K.
God.
I mean, so obviously
very different.
Very different. Now, I've got this thing in my pocket that's got almost 250 megabytes or more on, and it's the size of a pencil, it's tiny. So there's all those technical changes. In the manufacturing area, I mean, we're making tablets. It was an oral solid dose was mainly what I got involved with. And in the old days, it was planetary mixers. It was a bit like baking. It was like a baker's. And you starch paste into the powders, and basically the operator determined when the end point was by putting his hand in and giving it a squeeze.
It's a little bit different.
Yeah,
nowadays.
It's a little bit different, yeah. And again, within a relatively short space of time, we'd gone over to high shear mixers and proper electronic endpoint detection. The other thing I remember was no calculators in those days when I first joined the labs.
And what was used instead?
I was given an Otis King calculator. I've still got it. And basically it's a slide rule, but it's done as a cylinder. It's wound around 2 cylinders. So it's like a slide rule 2 meters long in a cylinder, and you've got a cursor you moved up and down. So that's what we had to do, calculations.
Wow. It's very different times, and I assume back then as well, things were different even in terms of everybody's clothing and, what people wore, the trends of the time, the music of the time and all the rest
Obviously,
of it.
It was the 70s, so we all had flared trousers.
Exactly.
And, and rather loud clothes. And, of course, being in a lab, you didn't wear your best clothes in a lab ever.
No.
So, yes, it was pretty casual, but, yeah. The other thing was, in doing the calculations, obviously you had to work out the answer, the result from the analysis you were doing. But when I joined the lab at Eli Lilly in 1974, we control charted all of the results.
Right.
Looking
very
for trends,
yeah.
And I saw the value of it. And I've been a passionate advocate of statistical process control ever since. And it was a pain to work out, the control limits and things. Working out a standard deviation using log tables or one of these Otis King calculators was a real pain. These days, you can do it in seconds using software like Minitab or Northwest Analyst, and people still don't do it.
Yeah, and I can understand that. And of course, technology is advancing all the time, so we're going to see more and more changes, aren't we, as we go forward? I mean, what are you anticipating going forwards?
Oh, gosh. In terms of technology, I mean, the big change, I think, for the pharmaceutical industry over the last 25 years has been the move from, I'm a chemist. And, when I joined the industry, all of the technology was chemistry. Once I moved out of the lab, I ran an API plant making, chemical APIs. And, of course, now everything's going biologic. And so that's really since the late 90s has been the big change for the industry. And it's the way things are going to go. So we'll still have the need for some chemical drugs. People will still need ibuprofen and paracetamols and things like that. But the real cutting edge stuff is going to be biologics, and the advanced therapies, cell and gene therapies are going to be the future. So technologically, that's going to be the way things are going. But the other thing that's changed enormously in the industry is supply chains.
Oh, go on. Do say.
Well, although I joined the lab at Eli Lilly in November 1974, I'd actually worked there in 1971 and 72 as a summer vacation student when I was still at school. And so I got to see the plant. Now, at that time, it was a plant in the UK, and it made all the dosage forms. It made sterile dosage forms, it made ointments, creams, and it made oral solid dosage forms. Even by the time I joined in the end of 74, the steriles had gone. And very quickly, probably within 5 years, the liquids and creams went. And so it then became an oral solid dose site. So you've seen this change from the general demographic is a site in a country making everything for that particular country to what we have now is global centres of excellence making for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Like India, for example, which
exactly.
call themselves, the pharmacy of the world.
Yeah, so that's created enormous change, and it was interesting because the regulators took a long time to catch up with that change. That happened from the 70s, 80s through the 90s for industry, so that by the late 90s, pretty much that was the standard model for most, certainly for the big, I work for branded companies, so for the big branded companies, that was the way you did it. Basingstoke in the UK became the oral solid dose site. We had a site in France that made all the sterile products, and so that was typically how it was organised. But when I was, because I was in the same company for over 30 years, one of the things I consciously did was get involved with outside bodies, because I didn't want the company blinkers on. You can get too involved in the way that company does things, and I wanted to take a look at how other people did those things.
And what did you see? When you say taking an outside view, what were you looking at?
Well, what I did was, I'd become a QP in the mid-'80s, so I joined in the UK first, the Pharmaceutical Quality Group, which is really a group for QPs, and I went on the committee. And that's my first input to training. I got involved with running they had a training course, run in association with David Begg Associates.
Okay.
And so through the 90s, I ran their training course along with David Begg Associates, and I joined the committee. And then I went and joined the QP. I was asked to join the QP assessor panel for the Royal Society of Chemistry. And then in my latter years, I've been in QA. I went into QA in the late 80s, and so I'd been in QA by 12 years or so by the 90s. I was asked by the company to become the company representative on the FPIA committee, the Manufacturing and GMP committee. And through that, I got involved with ICH.
Okay.
Now, in 2002, I think it was, the FDA came up with the 21st Century GMP initiative. It was an initiative by Janet Woodcock, who's just retired from FDA,
Yes, that's true.
at the beginning of this year,
Yep.
kicked off along with Ajaz Hussain, who joined them, I think, from academia. And what they wanted to do was try and modernise GMPs. Now, industry leapt on this because we thought it was a great idea. And so I was on the FPIA committee at the time. And what we did was they arranged in July 2003 in Brussels, a GMP workshop, which because remember, ICH then was just America, Japan, and the EU with the industry and the regulators. So what we did was we had this workshop. Each bit of it, each of the 6 partners could send 5 representatives.
So a fair number of people in the same room.
A fair number of people in
saying.
the same room. And then there was all the observers. So there's probably about 60-odd people in this room. And what they said was each of the members could do a 20-minute presentation as how they saw the future of GMP.
And were you one of the ones that did a presentation?
I helped put together the presentation,
right?
Because this was a revelation. Was where I'm going to say we ambushed the regulators, but we certainly took them by surprise. Because what industry did was the Japanese, the Americans, and the European industry got together, and we all worked prior to this meeting for about 6 months to put a 1-hour industry presentation together as how the industry saw the future of GMP and what the problems were with the current setup. And the main thrust of our argument was that actually the regulations were holding industry back. They were stifling innovation because it was just too difficult, and you couldn't make you didn't want to make the investment to innovate if you knew in one area of the world it wasn't going to be accepted what was the point then? Because you'd have to have the old and the new, and there was no point in moving forward.
And that's always a challenge, isn't it, where you've got different requirements in different locations, especially when it comes to things like innovation. And I think the other thing to note, I mean, you're talking about a number of years ago, obviously, and things have progressed, but we're always going to be in the situation where regulations fall behind the times of what's actually happening in industry. Regulators might prompt and sow seeds to get things moving. But actually the industry is what really takes it forward. So that's what mobilises it, don't you think?
And, the FDA's point, and Janet Woodcock was saying, look, we don't want to be a drag anchor. We want to have better ways of working, more innovative ways of working, because that in the end benefits patients.
Absolutely.
So and the fact that the industry stood up and gave a 1-hour presentation from the view of industry, whereas the regulators, we had the Japanese view, we had the European view, and we had the American view, and they weren't by no means the same. And so I think that was a light bulb moment for the regulators, because very shortly afterwards, Emma Cook from the EMA at the time was head of inspections at EMA, and she very soon moved over to head of international liaison. And so you've got a lot more international liaison. And I think we're seeing the benefits of that in, 2015, ICH is now starting to has expanded. I think we're now at 23 members in ICH and 35 observers. Whereas, just 20 odd years ago, we had 6 members and I think 3 or 4 observers.
And there's a huge number of these international groups now that are really making progress in things like harmonization and raising the standard across the board and supporting those developing countries as well, aren't there? I mean, there's a whole raft of them.
I mean, I was from industry. I think ICH is the most important one because it's the only forum where industry has a voice. An equal voice. You've got lots of other forums. You've got PICS that predated ICH, which is, I would say, just an inspectors club. But now you've got organisations like ICMRA, which are at a much more senior level within agencies, and that's really making some efforts now, trying to harmonise post-market variations and things like that. So some really interesting projects going on.
There were a lot of projects that came through the COVID as well, I think, and the pandemic generally through that, because there are a number of working groups which are really driving things forward. But the other area that I really want to ask you about is Brexit, or the exit from the EU. and what happened to the industry? How much impact has there really been, from your perspective, of that whole situation?
I think one of the sad things is it's actually not helped the UK manufacturing and testing industry, because the current situation is you can bring fully finished medicinal products in from the EU and you don't have to retest them, you don't have to QP certify them, you simply bring them into a wholesaler. As long as they've got an RPI, that's it. Then, in a sense, not much has changed. All right, you've got the new role of an RPI, but that's really not anything different. When I'm teaching this, I always say to people that, as far as the EU is concerned, obviously we're a third country now when they treat us as such. But as far as the UK is concerned, we're trying to pretend we're still in. So we bring stuff in. So why would you bring stuff into make it in the UK when you have to ship it to Europe to get it QP certified and retested? Make it in Europe and bring it into the UK. So it's not really helped. Certainly the GB, Northern Ireland, of course, still have privileged position where their testing and QP certification is accepted by the EU. So great for Northern Ireland. But I mean, you've only got to look at my own previous company. As I say, I worked for 30 years for Lilly. They closed, well before Brexit, they closed their manufacturing site in the UK, but they've now closed their research site in the UK. And guess where they're investing all their money, building new sites? Ireland.
Yeah, I can see that. And there's always going to be winners and losers in this sort of situation. And, I think there is something to be said about the agility of being a sort of sovereign nation, sovereign regulator and so on. And we saw that again through the pandemic, didn't we? So while I can see where you're coming from in some of the challenges that it's presented, there are also some benefits.
There are. I mean, hopefully Ian Rees's he calls it point of care. The Europeans are now calling it decentralised manufacturing.
That's true, yeah.
That concept, which was, dreamed up by Jan Rees at the MHRA, the legislation is now before the UK Parliament and is likely to be approved, if not by the end of the year, by very early next year. So that's likely to be implemented 6 months later, probably in the middle of next year, which is going to be several years before the Europeans. It's in the draft human medicines legislation changes, but we'll be lucky if we get the final version of that even through the European system by next year, and then it will probably have a 2 or 3 year implementation period. So again, that's allowed the UK to pivot and be more responsive in that area, and that's important for a very developing area, cell and gene therapy and some of those other things that are at the cutting edge, shall we say, of medicine. So yes, there's always pros and cons.
Yep.
But my heart has always been in manufacturing, and so
yeah, true. I mean, it's just interesting because it goes back to that point you were making earlier about innovation and regulators really trying to respond to the need to be more innovative and enable that. And point of care is a great example of that,
yes,
isn't it?
Absolutely.
Just taking a look at the relationship between the UK and the EU, do you think we'll ever get to a point where we'll have a really good relationship with mutual recognition, for example, or where do you think we'll get to?
If I had £1 for every time I've been asked that in the last 5 years, I'd be quite rich. The answer is simply, it's the P word, it's politics. It's all down to politics, and I'm hopeful that with a change of UK government, and then we're getting also by the end of the year a new commission, that there'll be, shall we say, a rapprochement between the EU. Some of the bad blood, perhaps, that happened around the time of Brexit will be forgotten, be in the past. We can come up with a much more mutually beneficial working relationship with the EU, because technically there is no reason at all why we couldn't have an MRA with the EU. It is simply politics.
And we do have already some level of reliance going on between the two parties. But again, it's very sort of, there are certain clauses around that, aren't there?
There are. I mean, obviously the UK had the reliance with the European Commission decision-making process. That came to an end at the beginning of this year. We now have the international reliance process, which has got, from memory, Canada, Australia, America, as well as the EU in that. And I think that makes sense from all the regulators' point of view. Patients are patients wherever they happen to be in the world. And as long as you're using good science to make your decisions, we don't have to make the same decision over and over again with different regulators. Now, that doesn't mean they always have to agree, of course. And, even within the EU, as we know, that even different agencies around the world do not always agree with each other, but it's a move in the right direction. And I think, as I say, I would chart that start of those harmonization efforts to that 2003 Brussels meeting. Everything has flowed from that, and we've got a lot more harmonization. We've got a long way to go, but the more efforts we can put in, because none of the regulators have got the resources to do everything that they're supposed to do.
No.
And so work sharing, or whatever you want to call it, makes perfect sense from their point of view and from patients' point of view. The quicker we can get innovative medicines to the market with the right level of scrutiny, though, we don't want to get products on the market that are not fit.
Totally, absolutely agree with you there. I mean, that's so important. And you touch on resource and things, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But you've described a really quite a difficult environment for industry to operate in, with all the changes that are going on between the countries and UK, EU, and so on. And if they're really moving forwards and want to try and get their innovative product on the market, what would your advice be to them?
Well, it's always been the problem. And as I say, I would think it's slightly easier now. But then, of course, as you said earlier, when new technology comes along, the regulators, there's always a lag, because the technical advances come from the industry. They don't come from the regulators, nor should they. So the regulators are always kind of behind the curve. And so good communication becomes the key then between the industry and regulators. And that really needs trust, that there is a level of trust between the industry and the regulators. We're going to see it with AI, is the latest technological change that's coming. Everybody's writing reflection papers and, thought papers, or whatever you want to call them. We haven't yet got any legislation in the UK. We've just got brand new legislation in the EU. Be interesting to see how that comes. It's not written for our industry. It's written generally, of course. But there's always going to be these challenges. And I think the key is communication. My worry is sometimes the regulators, because they're so strapped for resource, do struggle to keep up with this sort of thing, and I can sympathise.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, we've heard that obviously a number of regulators have innovative pathways now, and MHRA, of course, have one, their ILAP, the Innovative Licensing Access Pathway. And that's great to see it, but obviously we need to ensure that they have the right resource to manage that, because it's such a great initiative, and it'd be great to see products go down that line, and we're seeing more and more being going through that process. But it does come down to resource, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and it comes down to a degree of harmonisation. There's no point in putting all that effort to get a product to market in, I don't know, the EU or the UK, and it's not acceptable in the USA, for instance. The more harmonisation we can get, the better. And ICH is now, is expanded, I say, to 23 members and 35 observers. That's really going to help, because it is driving. And, of course, ICMA has expanded a lot as well. So there's a lot of work going on. And you've got the projects between ICH, ICMA, ILAP and PICS jointly working on stuff. And that's, it can only help, because at the end of the day, both the industry and the regulators want to bring good, effective medicines to market for patients. And so we've got plenty of disease challenges still. Cancer is always going to be a challenge. Alzheimer's, and, there's always going to be challenges to get new products to address these more challenging disease states.
And so, Pete, it's been a great summary of the history, from when you first started out in the industry all the way through to the current day, and indeed into the future. And I think my last question to you would be, what has been your favourite moments? What really sticks in your mind over those 50 years that you've been working in the industry?
I would say two favourite moments. I think that 2003 ICH GMP workshop in Brussels, because I think so much has flowed from that. We immediately got ICH Q8, Q9 and Q10. Well, I say immediately. They had to be written, but within 2 to 3 years. And that's flowed on now to 11, 12, 13, 14. We've got lots of ICH guidance out of that. So from a sort of technical point of view, professional point of view, I think that's one of my favourite moments. But the thing I've really enjoyed in the last 20 years is, since I left the industry and went over the dark side and became a consultant, and it was the training. I love training the next cadre of QPs, and I've been doing it now for 20 years. So it's great to see somebody come in as perhaps in their late 20s and a little bit unsure, go through all the QP training, pass their Viva. And now, of course, we meet them every year at the alumni meeting, and they're rising up to senior positions and starting to really influence the industry. So yeah, I think I get a great deal of personal pleasure out of coaching and training and mentoring the next generations of QPs. That's been very much a personal pleasure.
That's fantastic to hear, and I'm sure that all of those individuals that you're referring to have had a brilliant time learning from you and the history that you bring.
Well, I was very flattered and quite shocked. If you'd have videoed it, it would have been quite funny, I think, because I was sort of did my fish out of water impression, because at the alumni meeting this year, they presented me with a special award in recognition of the 50 years in industry and all the training. So that was very good. To get that recognition from that peer group, it was really very special.
And very well deserved, I think. We're going to end it there, but what we are doing in this, and we're creating this feature whereby we're asking current speakers to actually ask our next speaker a question. Our next speaker is Lynn Ensor. She's been in the industry equally quite a long time, not quite as long as you, I'm afraid, Pete, but she did 21 years, I think, at the US FDA, and she's also been a consultant for a number of years. But we're speaking with her next time about the regulatory landscape, so really taking it on from what we've been talking about today. What would your question be for Lynn?
Oh, I think I'd ask Lynn that, having been at the FDA for that long, and I'm sure she's covered several perhaps examples, but just to describe one of the more challenging regulatory situations she's come across, what was it and how did she cope?
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to hear the answer to that. I'm sure she's got lots of really interesting stories, especially from her time as a regulator. Well, thank you again, Pete. Really enjoyable session today. This has been Compliance Unlocked. I'm Sam Atkinson. Please do join us next time, where we'll be speaking to Lynn Ensor.